Easter teaching number 6, the trial before Caiaphas. In this part of the trial, 16 Sanhedrin laws were violated, and I will point these out as we go along. Luke 22:54 tells us that Jesus was led to the house of Caiaphas. Rule number 6 was violated. Sanhedrin trials could only be conducted in the Hall of Judgment of the temple compound. There were 71 members of the Sanhedrin, but only 23 were required in a trial. There are no references as to how many attended this trial, but the trial was being held in secret, at night, and in a personal household. Mark 14, verses 55 to 56 tells us, "The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death, but they couldn't find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree." In Jewish law, if a person was found to be a false witness in court, then the punishment that would have been meted out should the accused have been found guilty of that crime upon the false statement, then that same punishment was meted out to the one who gave false witness. That did not happen here, as the religious leaders were so desperate to find someone to accuse Jesus. Rule number 7 violated. During the trial, the defence had the first word before the prosecutors could present the accusations. This is the other way round to our own judicial system, but note, there was no defence lawyer to help Jesus, who had to represent himself. It is written in the verse in Mark quoted above that all the Sanhedrin were seeking to find him guilty. This is in violation of the next law. Rule number 8. All could argue in favour of an acquittal, but all could not argue in favour of a conviction. Finally, 2 witnesses come forward who seem to have the same testimony, but again this proved not to be the case. Mark 14:58 tells us the witness told that Jesus had said he will destroy the temple and in 3 days build another. But in Matthew 26:61, another witness told that Jesus had said, "I am able to destroy the temple and in 3 days build another." Both sound similar, but they are essentially different. One was a statement of intention and of one claiming to be able to. Again, at this point, Jesus should have been released, as the witnesses did not agree. Rule number 9. There were to be 2 or 3 witnesses, and their testimony had to agree in every detail. Caiaphas then demanded that Jesus answer the accusation that the men brought against him. That was in violation of rule number 10. There was no allowance for the accused to testify against himself. And as this was against their law, Jesus refused to testify and said nothing. So Caiaphas put him under an oath that demanded an answer by law. In Matthew 26:63, Caiaphas said, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus answered, "You have said so." This sounds rather a tame reply to us, but in Greek this was an emphatic yes. Caiaphas reacted by tearing his garments, but this show of emotion was not permitted by Sanhedrin law. Rule number 11 was violated. Based on Leviticus 21 verse 10, the high priest was forbidden to tear his garments. Caiaphas was almost relieved and said, "What further need have we of witnesses? We have heard his blasphemy." The witness statements had not accused Jesus. Rather, he was accused by answering the oath presented by the high priest. Therefore, the charge was brought by a judge in violation of Rule 12. Rule number 12. Judges could not initiate charges. They could only investigate charges brought to them. Rule number 13. The accusation of blasphemy was only valid if the name of God was pronounced. Jesus hadn't done this. He had merely claimed to be the Messiah. With no witnesses against him, and not speaking the name of God, he should have been released. Again, his rights were ignored. The law did not permit a man to be condemned solely by his own words. That is why the 2 or 3 witnesses had to be present. Jesus, however, was convicted on his claim to be the Messiah. Rule number 14. A person could not be condemned solely on the basis of his own words. Trials had to be carried out in public during the daylight hours. It would be assumed that if it was night, then everyone must have had a long day in court, so proceedings would need to be reconvened at next daylight, refreshed and with a clear mind before potentially condemning a person. Matthew 26 verse 66 tells us that those present at the trial said, "He is worthy of death." So Jesus was convicted of blasphemy and also given a sentence of death. Here, 5 laws were violated. Rule number 15. The verdict could not be pronounced at night. And it was still in the wee small hours of the morning, and it was still dark. Rule number 16. In the case of capital punishment, the trial and guilty verdict could not occur at the same time, but had to be separated by at least 24 hours. At Jesus' trial, he was found guilty within moments of his conviction. They agreed unanimously that he was guilty of the death penalty immediately, and the sentence of death was passed at the same time. This violated the next 3 laws. Rule number 17. Voting for the death penalty had to be done by individual count, beginning with the youngest, so that the young would not be influenced by the elders. The next rule, rule number 18. A unanimous decision for guilt showed innocence, since it is impossible for 23 to 71 men to agree without plotting. And rule number 19. The sentence could only be pronounced 3 days after the guilty verdict. Jesus should have been released once the unanimous decision had been reached of his guilt. This law was in force because it was believed that no case would have a unanimous vote for guilt without a conspiracy. See the irony? And the 19th law would allow time for potentially more evidence to be brought back to court, which may indeed help prove the innocence of the one accused. Matthew 26 verse 67 tells us that the religious leaders then spat in Jesus' face, struck him with their fists, and slapped him and mocked him, asking, "Prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you?" Luke 22 verses 63 to 65 tells us they blindfolded him and spoke many other things to him and reviled him and beat him. This was in violation of the next 2 laws. Rule number 20. Judges were to be humane and kind. Rule number 21. A person condemned to death could not be scourged or beaten before his execution. We will also mention the last of the Sanhedrin's own laws that were violated during this mockery of a trial. Jesus' trial took place between the first night and the first day of Passover. This was in violation of the last of the 22 Sanhedrin laws that were ignored. Rule 22. No trials were permitted on the eve of the Sabbath or on a feast day. It is at this point in the events that Peter made his 3 denials of Christ, and if you would like to read more of this, it is recorded in Matthew 26, 69 to 75, Mark 14, verses 66 to 72, Luke 22, 54 to 62, and John 18, 25 to 27. It had been a long night and was beginning to get light. The day was breaking. It was time for Jesus' next trial.